In this video, I will show you more than 30 possible uses of the node controller mod in City Skylines to change and fully customize railways, pedestrian paths, and all the other networks. We covered roads in the previous part, so check that one out too. I will be using the older original node controller because right now some of these things are only possible with it, but the renewal version is constantly improving, so if you are watching this video sometime after it was released, chances are the renewal version can already do everything. But that's not really the point here. I'm just going to give you the ideas. Which tool you choose with what limitations is up to you. It's your game after all. Anyway, let's jump right into it and start with the railways. When you are building railways to train stations, it's going to build these switches at the ends, and if you are using vanilla tracks, which I highly don't recommend, then you can easily just make this much better looking. First of all, you can use the corner offset, that's one thing, because you can make the switch just better by making it larger so the trains are not going to look that weird going across it, and you can also put the ties below it, because by default this is a custom node type, but look at that, you can change it to bend, and it's going to actually have the ties underneath it. That's kind of great. And if you don't need these switches because, you know, this is like a through train station, trains don't really need to switch tracks, then you can easily switch it to nodeless and you're not going to have the switch there at all. Now, obviously, I just highly recommend that you use the railways from the railway collection and to use these kinds of tracks. And in here, it works in a similar way. By default, it creates the custom node type, which has these switches. They are by default already much longer than the vanilla, but you can make them even longer or shorter with the node controller. And again, you can, the bend doesn't do anything in here because the ties are already there, but you can easily just switch it into nodeless, and you don't need to destroy the tracks if you want to actually use the nodeless variants of the tracks, for example. Now, by the way, if you do use the nodeless tracks, then it doesn't weigh the other way around. You cannot change the nodeless tracks into noded like this. If you're going to make it into custom, it's kind of going to create the switch, but not at the node. It's going to create it in front of it, which might actually be beneficial to you if you want to have the track on the station, you know, like a constant length, and you don't really want the switch to be going into the station. So this is kind of useful. But probably the most useful thing with railways and node controller is the splitting of these double tracks. Now, yeah, sure, in some situations you might just simply build these one-way tracks with actual one-direction tracks, and if you align them right, then it's going to do these kinds of almost seamless transitions. But sometimes maybe this double track is one way only as well, or maybe you want to have these single tracks go both ways. In that case, it would create these kinds of weird switches, transitions that just don't look very good. And what you can easily do is actually use the nodeless variant, which I use all the time, I guess, and then you can use the node controller. You're just going to take the single track segments and by holding Control-Alt both, you're just going to move this outward number to either 2 or -2, depending on how, you know, it looks like in that orientation, and do the same thing on the opposite track, and that's it. Well, actually not. You're just going to move it and then align it with holding Alt so that the tangent lines are obviously going to be aligned like this. Now let's take this situation for example. I have this double track, but it's made only with one way, and I want to create some kind of a simple switch between those two tracks. And again, I can do that easily with the node controller using, for example, this one, the nodeless variant of a single track. Now what I'm going to do first, I'm going to move it, and I'm going to move this segment like this, kind of out of the way. Then I'm just going to move or build this kind of a single segment right there. I'm going to take the node controller again, Control-Alt, holding it both, and move the outwards direction to the starting track. And then on the other end, I'm just going to do this segment, but the opposite way. There we go. And since it's already aligned straight, it's already going to do that perfect transition. I'm just going to put this track back. If I don't want the size of the switch, the length of the switch, I can just move the start of the end or the end segments. I can align it so that, for example, the ties are looking good, and overall I just have this nice little smooth switch. And by the way, I should add that all of these things are functional. Trains will go on these manipulated tracks. And just like before with splitting the tracks, you can also, especially in some kind of train yards, do these kinds of single splits from these tracks. So if you build a track like this, for example, and you want it to just go somewhere else, only from one side of this double track, then again, that's exactly the same thing. You're just going to hold Control Alt and do the outwards by 2 like that, and take move it and perfectly align it. And just like we did with the highways, you can make these kinds of ends or transitions to bridge segments. You can make them aligned with these kinds of non-perpendicular roads. If you, for example, have a quay here or some kind of a retaining wall, right? So what you would do is you would take this segment, you would just move it as close to the road as possible so that it's touching that one corner. And then you would just take the node controller, and on one of these segments, for example on the bridge, I would just start doing the backwards alignment like that. I would remember the number 4 in this case, and I would just do exactly the same thing over here, and that's going to give me this wall nicely aligned. Now let's talk about pedestrian paths, because this is where the node controller really shines. Now these are the park life paths, and I choose this as an example because they have kind of nice models, especially the elevated roads, and they have all kinds of different changes that you can do with the node controller and kind of manipulate and control these kinds of transitions and changes and everything. So let's, for example, start with choosing the node type. Now, by default, for example, these kinds of transitions between elevated and the ground, they are custom. Now, look at that. I can, for example, change it into bend. It's going to get rid of that offset for the railing, or I can just get rid of that completely and go nodeless. Now, what if I, for example, have this path sloped like this, and I would like to create some kind of a rest for people, so it's not just a straight path up? Well, I can just make it, for example, custom over here. That's going to allow me to either make it sloped like it was before, or turn it flat. And this path in particular is going to do this kind of offset with the railing. So that might be like a place for benches or something like that, just some decorations. So that's kind of nice. Now, these kinds of bends, they are by default custom as well. And this particular path is, I don't know, not looking all that well with this, so you can actually turn it into bend. And look at that, that's going to get rid of it. You can even go nodeless if you wanted to in some situations. Now, these kinds of different paths from park life, but again, this applies to any kind of workshop paths as well. You can do that too. For example, this path I really like using, especially in some kind of like nature areas around ponds or something like that. This is really good looking, but these kinds of, I don't know what this is, like asphalt bends, these are kind of destroying it. So look at that. I'm just going to turn it into bend and it's going to go away. Or I can do nodeless again, just like before. This path in particular is kind of the other way around, because in here you kind of do want to use these kinds of walls here and there. They are just an interesting element. So but if you don't want to, you can again turn it into a bend, but you can actually make these kinds of straight nodes or nodes between two straight segments. You can also make them custom, which is going to give you this nice little wall, which might be just connected to some kind of a building or a pillar or something like that. And obviously, using the corner offset, you can make it even larger like this. So all these kinds of different things are possible with just choosing the node type with pedestrian paths and doing something with the corner offset. And this of course applies even to the ground segments. So I have, for example, a node right here, and this particular path is going to give me this like an asphalt thing. So it might look good on its own, just like this, some kind of a transition or some kind of a marker. You know, it might look good in combination with some curbs or some kind of plaza markings or something like that. And again, corner offset is going to make this area much larger. Of course, the node controller can be easily used to make these kinds of paths either wider, much wider actually, or tinier, which might be, you know, beneficial if you want to just create some tiny paths between some different places where people are not really walking all that much, but you do want to have that path in there, so you can make them really, really tiny. But beware that people might then start, if it's like 10% value, obviously, then people might then start just hovering on the sides of the path. Another thing is, if you are trying to use invisible pedestrian paths and you want to connect them to the existing paths, then some of these paths have different sizes and they might look slightly strange. So for example, this 8-meter invisible pedestrian path is going to do this, but if you want to use this narrow one, it's going to do this strange transition. So one way to get rid of it is, for example, go nodeless. That's going to solve it right away. Now, by default, these pedestrian paths have this corner radius, and you can't really go lower by just lowering the corner offset because it's already 0. You can make it go higher, increase the radius of this bend, but you cannot go lower more than the 0 in here. I'm not really sure if you type in minus values. No, it's not going to do anything, so don't try that even. But you can actually go into just the segments ends, and you can manipulate these outer and inner edges. So for the outer edge, I can go for something like minus 10, for example, and I can actually do the exact same thing on this opposite segment. And look at that. That's a nice sharp corner. I can even lower the inner part, going minus 2, looks like it might be it. And look at that. Absolutely perfectly sharp corner. Even 0 glitches with the textures. That is looking absolutely great. Now, some paths are going to look better than others. I think that this boardwalk, for example, is not exactly going to look that great because these kinds of asymmetrical manipulation are obviously going to stretch. Wait, that was too much. Minus 11, because they're obviously going to stretch even the base shape of the road. Actually, minus 10 should have been it. And down here, minus 2. Yeah, so this one looks slightly worse. As you can see, it's distorting the inside of the segment. In this one, it's not really that visible that that's happening, but, you know, it's up to you. But these are actually looking really, really good, really clean. Now, you can also do something about the vertical alignment. So, for example, by default, again, these kinds of paths have this like a natural transition from the flat into the curved or into the slope, right? Now, if you wanted to, for example, create stairs underneath this path, I don't have stairs prop right now, so I can't really show you, but you can prepare these networks so that you have just the railings. And you can easily do that by just going into the segment end and just deleting the direction length, okay? Or, well, putting it to 0. So just going to do that at the start and at the end. And look at that. It's going to now create a perfectly sharp edge between, this view is showing that very well, between the flat and between the slope. So you can then make it, for example, much shorter and then just put like a prop stair directly below it. So that's going to match the curvature or the slope, and you can have nice stairs. And you could have seen me that when I was doing the move it manipulation, these kinds of paths, it was kind of twitching or something. You can easily change that, or if you wanted to just precisely manipulate the slope, then you can obviously just go to the segment end again, and then with holding control, do the backwards motion, and it's going to do it more precisely. Also, you might want to do this if you are preparing for a conversion into invisible pedestrian paths, because if you are preparing some kind of complicated stairs or something, then you're just going to match it exactly to the stairs that you have around this place, and then you're going to convert it into the invisible pedestrian paths. Let me quickly show you that. If I do the conversion, then obviously these days the node controller settings are remembered. As you can see, directions are again 0 in this case. So if I then go back into the pedestrian path that I had here before, the settings stay the same. And just like with roads, even here we can create those nice little cute arches, and it's super easy to do that with only a single segment. We're just going to hold control, do some kind of direction changes in here, for example 0.5. We can go higher than the roads because obviously people can go on much bigger bumps like this, and then we're going to take the backwards direction, put it to 0.9 because that's going to clear it up nicely. And look at that cute little arch bridge. That's going to look super good. Just like this, you don't even need to do any kind of changes. It's going to look super good in some kind of parks, over little streams or ponds or something like that. The vanilla canals can also be changed with the node controller. Look at this. So this is, for example, the narrow version, and this is the wider. And if you're not satisfied with the size of the transition, then there is nothing easier than just doing the corner offset changes. You can put it to some kind of really big number, which is going to make it really, really smooth, or you can go all the way to 0, even below the default value of the game. And if you want to go even lower, you can just go to the segment end and do these kinds of backwards changes. Now, not only that, but you can simply just manipulate the sizes of the canals themselves with the outward changes, of course, and making the canals wider or narrower. Now beware, there is this little thing with the node controller and all these kinds of manipulations of networks that come in contact with water, or that are changing the volume of water, right? So for example, if you make the canal wider or narrower, then at every map load, there is going to be this little like water spike. Well, maybe not even that little, it might be actually really big, but if you're going to run the simulation, it's immediately going to go back, and after a couple of minutes, it's going to stabilize. So don't worry, that's kind of normal behavior, and it's fine. And even the canals, just like roads and all the other networks, they can use the embankment function. So you can, for example, rotate them like this and make one part of the wall just higher than the other. Obviously, it's not going to affect much the water flowing through it. It's going to still remain at the level. But if you, I don't know, want to have some kind of a higher wall on one side, some kind of a viewing area or some kind of pedestrian path around it, you know, something like that. Obviously, possibilities are endless. But yeah, you can do that even with canals. Keys can also be changed with the node controller, even though in here you have to be a bit more careful. You can definitely stretch them, you can make them wider. Even though the vanilla keys, or any kind of keys really, are already kind of wide, maybe you would like to make them actually smaller. But in here you have to be careful. You can see that the terrain is then going to start appearing on the lower parts of the key. Obviously, the thinner it goes, the worse it's going to get. Now, of course, you can just stretch one part of the wall, and then there is going to create this nice smooth transition to the original size. So that's something that I've been using as well recently, and it's looking really good. Now, these kinds of corners, again, you can make it much higher or bigger radius with using the corner offset. It's kind of going to start doing something at, what is that, 25? Yeah, 26 is going to start appearing some changes. But you can actually do this even lower, just like we did with the pedestrian paths. You're going to go into the segment's ends. You're going to go into the backwards values, and you're just going to go with negative values in here. Let's try maybe minus 30. I'm not really sure. I haven't done this before, but minus 30. Let's see. Minus. No. It's going to be even more. 40 perhaps. 45 maybe. Yeah, something like this. But you definitely get the idea. You can just play with this until 51 maybe might be the best value in here. Yeah, looks like it. 51 is probably the value that you need to do. And actually, terrain-wise, this is looking absolutely perfect. It's not doing any kind of glitches. Just like with the pedestrian path, this is working absolutely perfectly. Also, just like with the pedestrian paths, even here you can do something about these kinds of vertical slopes and these kinds of transitions. Go to the first segment of the sloped one and again delete the direction length, or not delete it, but put it to 0. And you have to do it on both ends of the key. And look at that, this might be useful in some kind of situations. You now have it perfectly flat, perfectly straight with this hard transition down here. Now, for example, these kinds of cliff profiles that you can download from the workshop, or just the grass and pavement profiles, there's a whole pack of these made by DHEX. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it right. So these are very, very useful. So for some kind of natural detailing or edges of railways, embankments, roads, whatever you imagine. And they come in many different sizes, but maybe you would like to get something in between these, I don't know, 30 and 45 meters. Obviously, you can use the node controller, especially the embankment. Because with these, obviously, you can just turn it around and manipulate it however you want. You can even make it stretched, of course, which is kind of going to help with the embankment a bit. Obviously, if it's stretched more, then lower values of the embankments are going to give you like more changes on the edges, clearly. And you can just fit this so much freely to any kinds of things that you might imagine. Now, also in the workshop, you might come across these kinds of decorative surfaces. So, for example, the surface networks, grass, asphalt, and, whatever kinds of themes. And also the clipping networks, that's kind of interesting. For example, these, the roof surfaces, all these kinds of different networks. Now, what if you want to fill specific shapes with them? Well, obviously, using the node controller. In here, I would highly recommend that you just forget these numbers and just, manipulate these edges directly, just like this. And you can fill very specifically looking places with these kinds of shapes. As you can see, it's super easy. And not only can you manipulate the networks like this on the ground, but you can obviously raise them. You can raise these nodes and change the vertical position. So you might be able to just fill some really crazy areas with these kinds of surface networks. Also, this is a really cool idea. You can actually use the vanilla pavement path or the gravel path, for example, and you can use it to cover areas with pavement. So you can, for example, do something like this, and very, very quickly and very accurately, with just using a single network, you can fill some place with pavement. And this was something similar. I was just using the dirt path made by Ronix, and I just stretched it so that it's going to form some sort of a dirt parking lot. Now, this is going to be a technique that is slightly advanced, but I'm just going to show you the principle and you will immediately understand what I mean. So I have this bare bridge road made by KJ. I'm actually going to switch it into elevated. And this road has a really nice feature, and it's not pulling the terrain up to it. And it's basically just the road. Now, you might decorate some kind of sidewalks around it or whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is that I'm now going to take, for example, the pedestrian paths that we had before, and I'm going to show you some kind of a cool trick that I recently learned. So I'm going to align this perfectly using Move It to the road. Now I would like to take invisible paths and get rid of the closed off ends of the railings, right? So I would like to do something like this, for example. Then I would probably like to stretch it to the sides of the roads. And let's just say that I really like the railing on this path, okay? And I would like to put it on the side of this road. But let's just imagine that this road is just super wide or something like that. And for some reason, I'm not going to be able to just stretch this road so that I can have the railings on both sides from this network. Or I would like to have the railings different on both sides, okay? Now, what I can do is I can actually put this higher. Yeah, it's going to do these terrain changes. Whatever, this is just a quick example. And I'm going to do embankment. And I'm going to do the embankment so that basically the lower part of the railing, if I look at it like this, is going to already go above the lower part of the railing, okay? So in this particular case, this gives me some 20 degrees. Now I'm going to go to the other side and I'm going to do the embankment, but obviously negative on the opposite side. And now I'm just going to go and take this pedestrian path and match it nicely to the side of the road, okay? So something, oh yeah, that's going to give me these little problems with Move It, but that's fine. Just need to move the camera in a better angle, and look at this. Obviously, even the railing is slightly tilted now, but that might be fine. And you can just use this to detail the edges of some kind of elevated paths and whatever. And this is like a nice bonus. It's actually going to create this like a underbelly of the bridge, which might be actually looking rather good. Now, also you can use functional networks like roads or railways or whatever to actually use them as decorations. Now, this is kind of difficult to explain unless I show you like something completely finished. I'm probably going to put a couple of pictures from Aurelia in here because there I used it. But let's just imagine that, for example, this bridge is like much wider, okay? Let's just really, we have to use our imaginations, and this is like a super big highway bridge. Or maybe it's like a road that's partially hanging over the side of some kind of a wall. Okay, it doesn't really matter. And the point is that we can actually use any kind of network that we have. For example, this road, this Industries road, because it kind of has a nice structure below it. And we can do the same thing like before. We can do the embankment. We can, for example, turn it to like 30 degrees. Doesn't really matter. The value here, this is kind of up to you how you want it. And we can just create the actual structure of the support or the bridge or something below it. I'm going to obviously put it below the road so that the railing is just going to disappear, and it's just going to give me this structure. It's, like I said, kind of difficult to explain what I mean by this, but yeah, I'm going to give you those pictures here. You can probably see them right now, and you can just use these kinds of networks. In these examples, I used the network extensions, the promenade, the pedestrian promenade, for example, and to do these kinds of decorative networks. They obviously have the big advantage that you can make them curved and fit them under whatever you're doing. With Node Controller, you can, for example, change the sizes of wire networks. Now, these are the double wires from the railway collection, and if you want to just make them go over some kind of tracks or over tram roads, for example, which are narrower, well, you can easily just do that by changing the stretching slider in the Node Controller. Now, also in the workshop, you might find some really nice looking bridge structures that are made either for roads or only railways. And what if you really wanted to use them for something different and maybe make this bridge work for roads? Well, you can actually do that super easily. Let me just quickly build like a typical bridge in here. I'm just going to move it, going to align it perfectly. I'm gonna move it inside, but yeah, there is this little problem, and as you can see, the bridge is just not wide enough. Well, obviously we are going to use the node controller. This is a bit fiddly because it's much better to just manipulate the network outside of the road. I'm now going to go through it very, very fast. Let me just try to do it 200% maybe, and then I'm just going to put the road inside of it, make it go higher so that it covers the tracks, and look at that. The railing actually kind of goes to the sides of the road, which might be, okay looking, so you might be able to create your own bridge types like this very, very easily. Another major use of the node controller is for the terraforming network, because this is the invisible network that is going to allow you to manipulate the terrain. Obviously, you can just use move it and move one end of the terraforming up and down, for example. But I like using the node controller on it because not only you can make it, for example, stretched like this, actually not just 200%, but for example, 1000%, which is going to save you a lot of, for example, the network limits. Because if you are trying to make some kind of a sloped area like that, then you can just do it with a single network. Now, let's take a look at, for example, the embankments, or yeah, embankments, not slopes. And in here, look at this. This is super powerful, especially now that the terraforming network is stretched this much. You can just do all these kinds of crazy, but very, very controlled and accurate surfaces like this. So this might be useful in some kind of embankments or something like that. Obviously you need to adapt this idea to your cities. And again, you can just take these kinds of segments ends nodes and just move them freely like this. Also, by default, the ends of the terraforming networks are not flat. It's a bit difficult to explain what I mean, so I'm just going to show you. Basically, if you, with move it, put some kind of a slope on the terraforming network, then, for example, on the higher node right here, you can see that past the node, the terrain is still going higher, some couple of meters, right? And this can be super annoying if you are trying to put that terrain to like a specific height. But as you can see, I can just check the flatten segments ends, and then it's just going to be completely flat. It's going to be at the same height as the end node. And also it's going to give you that nice vertical curvature to the terraforming networks just by clicking that flatten segments ends. Now, this is another thing with the terraforming network. Just like we did with the roads and pedestrian paths, you can also make arches with the terraforming network. And obviously in here, you can go super crazy. You can couple this with the stretching and create some really wild looking terrain features, or maybe like hangars, for example, for some kind of military planes. You can do with the terrain, and possibilities are kind of endless, but this is just something really interesting to try. Now, when it comes to all the rest of the decorative networks, like for example brick walls or stone walls or stuff like that, then pretty much the same rules apply to them as well. Just like before with the quays or the canals, you can make them obviously wider with the node controller. It's a bit fiddly to click them because they are just so narrow, but especially these kinds of brick retaining walls, I definitely like to make them wider with the node controller. Or you can also do the slopes, especially if you are using these kinds of networks on the sides of, let me actually quickly put another segment in here. If you are using these on the sides of like stairs, for example, then obviously these kinds of transitions are not looking that great. So just like before, we are going to take the node controller and the direction length. We are going to make it go to 0, and that's going to serve nicely as some kind of, yeah, it's really difficult to click this. It's going to just make it much better looking, aligned to some kind of stairs. Now, this is going to be the last interesting idea. So basically what I'm doing in here is I have this very flat network, for example, this kind of a racing curb, right? And I want to make it into more like a box shape. So what I can do is I can make it a couple of times in here. I can make one of them, or two of them on both sides. I'm just quickly showing it here on one side only. I can make it with the embankment of 90 degrees, make it completely vertical. Then I'm going to just align them perfectly so that they are going to be parallel. And with move it, I'm just going to make it go to perfectly the sides like that, and going to make it higher, of course, and make it into some sort of a box like that. So using a couple of networks that are looking similar, you can just create completely new shapes. So again, that's just like an interesting idea to maybe try. Okay, so those were the node controller ideas and possible uses for the rest of the networks in City Skylines. Hopefully this list gave you some ideas how you can use the node controller in your cities. If it did, then you can push the video forward by clicking the thumbs up, leaving a comment, subscribing if you're new here, and if you want to directly support the channel, you can become a channel member. Big thanks to all the channel supporters that we have right now. Thank you again for watching, and goodbye.